If you could speculate as to why CMHC may have been using data from over 20 years ago to make its decisions on this matter.
So CMHC uses a funding allocation program to allocate their funds to their regional offices and provinces. Using old data, 2001 census data hasn't kept up with changes in the population for many, many years. And when CMHC updated their analysis by using the most current 2021 census data, what they discovered was that some provinces had been underfunded over the years, and other provinces had been overfunded for the years. The Crown Corporation couldn't tell us why. My take on likely one of the reasons why would be that it would mean perhaps removing funding, historical funding given to a community in order to fund another based on the fact that population growth or people have moved in different provinces versus others. So I think it's an excellent question to ask the Crown if you have the opportunity.
Thank you, and I'm sure we will. Turning now to Mr. Chen, you have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Auditor General for this report. In your report, you indicate a number of facts and findings, one of which is that there was no meaningful improvement in housing condition for First Nation communities from the period between 2015 and 2022. You indicate that the percentage of homes in need of major repairs decreased from 20.8% to 19.7%, but the homes that needed to be replaced increased from 5.6% to 6.5%. So this to me would indicate that there are more prohibitive to repair homes versus those that need general repairs that are receiving at least percentage-wise more repairs. So can you shed further light onto why there are more homes that cannot be replaced, yet there seems to be more homes that are receiving repairs?
So I might ask Mr. Wheeler to add in on the split, but I guess what I would offer up first is, back in 2021, the Assembly of First Nations with Indigenous Services Canada developed an estimate of what it would cost to repair and replace homes to help close the housing gap in First Nations communities. And they didn't have a plan, however, over the years to determine how they would fund that. Right? So they've spent $4 billion over the last 5 years, but without having a plan, you don't know how you're going to finance this investment going forward and making the decision between, allocating your funding for repairs and renovation. So I don't know if, Glenn, you'd like to add anything to that?
Mr. Chair, maybe just a point of clarification on Exhibit 2.4. I think perhaps a better way to look at it would be the variation between 5.6 and 6.5 in terms of housing needing to be replaced. Those are houses that are beyond the point where undertaking repairs would be economically feasible and allow people to continue to live in the homes, whereas the 20.8 to 19.7% change is reflecting housing in need of major repairs. So those houses are houses that still can be lived in, but they need major repairs to roofs or flooring or foundations. So it's not really. It doesn't make sense to compare sort of the two. They're two different things. But the larger issue, why you don't see an improvement perhaps, is that even though, for example, over 11,000 new houses have been built, or in the process of being built in the period under which we took our audit, as time goes by, houses that perhaps were in need of major repairs but were not repaired then become. They are no longer. You can no longer live in them. So there's a bunch of different things happening, which lead to the trend you see in our report, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So, the Auditor General makes a number of recommendations in this report, and I could not help but note in reading the report that the responses from the various departments were in agreement to the Auditor General's recommendations, with the exception of recommendation found in paragraph 2.39, which says Indigenous Services Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation should work with the First Nations communities with the poorest housing conditions to ensure that they receive the support they need to improve housing conditions. The report indicates here that the response of each entity was partially agreed. Auditor General, are you satisfied that there is only partial agreement with your recommendation? And could you tell us a bit more about what you heard back?
So obviously, no, I'm not satisfied that they've partially agreed. We think that our recommendation is one that would improve the situation for First Nations communities within the current policy framework. The department and CMHC disagreed with us because they feel that the program is one of applying for funding. So it is up to communities to identify their needs and then submit an application to receive the available funding. It is our view that when you have a capacity issue and some communities are unable to apply, then those who are likely in the greatest need or have the poorest housing conditions aren't accessing the funding. Our recommendation was about improving access and creating awareness that funding exists to help support communities to address mold problems or to replace or build homes. It isn't about being passive. It's about recognizing that some communities need different support, might need to be aware of a program and apply for it, whereas others communities are more self-sustaining and can apply without the support of the department. So it's about tailoring that approach instead of just saying, well, the program is an application one, please identify your needs and apply.
Based on your experience and expertise that you have developed in examining a wide range of different programs across different government departments, what types of initiatives could the departments employ to be more proactive, to reach out to communities that don't have the capacity to access funding for housing? Could you elaborate on your knowledge on this area?
Well, I think it would start with, first off, being aware of which communities aren't applying or don't have the capacity. If you look at many of our previous reports, whether it be about water or emergency preparedness or here housing and policing, they're all programs that require communities to apply. For example, the CMHC housing programs, there are 13 different programs that a community would have to figure out which 13 they may be eligible for and apply individually to each of them. That is very complex if you don't have a dedicated housing manager. But in my view, this approach that the government is using is one that is passive and siloed that hasn't been working over the last 2 decades. It's been 20 years that we have been looking at housing. And it's time for a fundamental shift in how the Indigenous Services Canada approaches these types of programs with communities if the goal is really to support them in self-determination. They need the knowledge and the awareness and the authority to have access to the funding, and some communities just need more help in knowing about the programs existing.
Thank you, and that is your time, Mr. Chen. Turn now, c'est Madame Sinclair Desgagnés. Vous avez la parole pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
You have the floor for 6 minutes. Madame Sinclair Desgagnés. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the Auditor General of Canada for these 3 reports. 2 are, no surprises and are devastating. Now, in a general way, and we heard it earlier, but it's been 2 decades, then we've seen little or no progress, whereas the situation is more than alarming on reserves. And I would like to hear you more. Of course, we heard you a little bit earlier about your thinking on this, but what is the problem? Is it incompetence at the federal government level or a lack of will? We do have to adopt a new approach, but how to adapt the approach quickly? In my opinion, policies and practices at present have not kept up with the evolving policies of federal government. So there is truth and reconciliation, and there is determination. Fundamentally, you need changes to structures. When you talk about policies, are you talking about the Indian Act and the promises made at the time of Confederation, or are you talking about more recent policies? Because, yes, there have been more recent promises, even some 10 years ago. There's strategies going back to 2008, but they have not been respected. People don't even know why. There's so many things, public safety, or in housing, or in construction of housing. It all comes from a much deeper problem, and that's what I'm asking. What is the federal government doing or not doing or deciding not to do, which should be done? So I come back to, is it lack of competence, lack of goodwill? The design of programs when it comes to housing, and even the indigenous policing, community policing programs go back to 96. Transport Canada talked about outdated policy and it not being flexible policy. So the departments are well aware that their processes and their policies need to be worked on. They are not working. Now, the passive approach, which is we're going to wait until the communities actually want to support them in self-determination. We're going to wait for them to apply when they don't even have the capacity to be able to do the applying. I mean, it's a breach of dialogue. You need to know what communities need to make progress. Earlier, you mentioned that there needs to be a change. Everyone understands it's not working. No one here would dare to say that it's going to end up by working. I can think back, you can't do things again and again and expect there to be a change. So you talked about a need in a comprehensive approach at the federal level. Can you speak to this further? Well, my mandate cannot touch on government policies. I can only examine the public services and the approaches taken. Now, the approach that is being used in support of self-determination and reconciliation is taking a step back to not impose anything on Indigenous communities. But the smallest communities that don't have the capacity or may not even be aware of programs are not helped by that. So by not changing the way of doing things, we're not changing the approach, you're not going to help these communities. But of course, policies need to be updated and, be hand in hand with government pledges. So in the report, we see that Quebec is doing a little bit better in terms of the proportion of housing that needs to be replaced or repaired. Quebec seems to be a little better off. Why would that be? I think it's a difficult issue, and it all depends. I mean, there are certain programs that have funding with provinces and territories. And when it comes to policing programs, of course, that is in step with provinces and territories' priorities. But there's limited money allocated to the provinces. And then it also depends on communities to be able to hold their hand up and apply for money. And Quebec Indigenous communities and BC Indigenous communities are larger and have more capacity to put in the applications. Then there is building capacity within Indigenous communities. If we want Indigenous communities to be able to organize themselves and be able to apply for federal government, you have to build capacity at the level of the communities so that they can then organize themselves. In Quebec, there's a funding ecosystem that's developed through SOCA and MACA. You can see those organizations that are there that are helping communities. I'm thinking of credit unions for local economic development. I know that's not the purpose of the audit, but I think it would be an important aspect to